If you love heart-pounding stories of aviation heroics, mentor-student bonds, and split-second decisions that mean the difference between life and death, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us bring you more incredible tales of courage in the sky. Second Lieutenant Jake Maverick Morrison gripped the stick of his F-16 Fighting Falcon as he climbed through 15,000 feet above the Nevada desert. At 24 years old, he was the youngest pilot in the 388th Fighter Wing, and today marked his first solo combat training mission over the restricted airspace of Area 51. His heart pounded with excitement and nerves as he executed a perfect barrel roll, the desert landscape spinning beneath his canopy. "Viper 1, this is Nellis Tower," crackled the radio. "You're cleared for weapons training exercise Bravo 7. Target coordinates uploading now." Jake acknowledged the transmission and checked his HUD display. Everything looked perfect. Fuel levels optimal, weapon systems green, navigation locked onto the practice bombing range 30 miles southeast. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the familiar surge of the Pratt & Whitney engine propelling him toward Mach 1. What Jake didn't know was that in the aging control tower at Nellis Air Force Base, a ghost from aviation's past was watching over him. Colonel Samuel Iron Eagle Reeves, 72 years old and officially retired for a decade, sat in the observation deck with a cup of coffee and eyes that had seen more aerial combat than any living pilot. His weathered hands bore scars from ejection injuries, and his gray eyes held the wisdom of someone who had survived 200 combat missions over Vietnam, the Gulf War, and countless classified operations. The old colonel wasn't supposed to be there. Officially, he was just visiting his former base, touring the facilities with other distinguished retirees. But something had drawn him to the tower that morning, a feeling he'd learned never to ignore during his 40-year career. Young pilots had a way of finding trouble, and his instincts told him today would be no exception. Jake was approaching the target range when his first indication of trouble appeared on his radar scope. Multiple bogies, moving fast and high, approaching from the northwest. His radio crackled with confused chatter from other training aircraft in the area. "Nellis Tower, this is Viper 1. I'm showing unknown aircraft on my scope. Bearing 320, altitude approximately 30,000. Are these part of the exercise?" The tower's response sent ice through Jake's veins. "Negative, Viper 1. We show no scheduled traffic in your area. Can you identify the aircraft type?" Jake climbed rapidly, pushing his F-16 to intercept the unknown contacts. As he gained altitude, he could make out 4 aircraft in tight formation, but they weren't showing up on IFF identification friend or foe systems. Worse, their flight characteristics looked aggressive, like they were preparing for a combat engagement. "Tower, this is Viper 1. Unknown aircraft are not responding to radio calls and appear to be foreign military jets. They're heading directly toward restricted airspace at high speed." In the tower, Colonel Reeves stood up abruptly, his coffee forgotten. He recognized the tension in the young pilot's voice, the same tone he'd heard from countless young aviators facing their first real crisis. The duty controller was handling the situation by the book, but Reeves could see on the radar scope that Jake was flying into a potentially deadly situation. "Son," Reeves said quietly to the duty controller, "mind if I take a listen?" The controller, recognizing the legendary pilot, handed him a spare headset without question. Colonel Reeves had taught half the senior officers on the base, and his reputation for saving pilots' lives was unmatched. Jake's situation deteriorated rapidly. The unknown aircraft had split into 2 pairs, executing a classic pincer movement that would trap his single F-16 a deadly crossfire. His training told him to disengage and call for backup, but the intruders were now only minutes from penetrating the most classified airspace in America. "Tower, I need immediate backup. These bogies are definitely hostile, and I'm outnumbered 4-1. The duty controller's response was professional, but devastating. "Viper 1, nearest backup is 12 minutes out. You are cleared to engage if fired upon, but do not pursue beyond restricted airspace boundaries." 12 minutes. Jake knew he'd be dead in 2. The lead hostile aircraft locked onto him with missile guidance radar, and Jake's threat warning system exploded into alarms. He had seconds to react before incoming missiles would turn his F-16 into scrap metal scattered across the desert floor. That's when a calm, gravelly voice came over his radio. A voice that wasn't from the official tower frequency. "Viper 1, this is Ghost Tower on emergency frequency. I'm Colonel Sam Reeves, and I'm going to help you stay alive. Do you copy?" Jake was pulling 8 grams in a desperate evasive maneuver, his vision graying at the edges from the crushing force. "Ghost Tower, I copy. I've got 4 hostiles with radar lock and nowhere to run." "Son, I've been flying fighters since before you were born. Trust me, and do exactly what I tell you. First, nose down 20 degrees and deploy chaff. Do it now. Jake followed the instructions instinctively. The chaff strips of radar reflecting aluminum bloomed behind his aircraft, just as two missiles streaked past his previous position. The colonel's timing had saved his life by seconds. Good work, kid. Now listen carefully. Those aren't random pirates, that's a coordinated attack formation. They're trying to herd you into the mountains where their friends are waiting. See that canyon system at your 2 o'clock? Jake glanced toward the rugged terrain. I see it, Ghost Tower. That's your salvation, but it's also your death trap if you do it wrong. Here's what we're going to do. Colonel Reeves' voice carried the calm authority of someone who had faced impossible odds and lived to tell about it. In the tower, he was studying multiple radar screens, weather data, and terrain maps with the efficiency of a master tactician. His mind was calculating angles, fuel consumption, and weapon capabilities at superhuman speed. Viper 1, drop to 500 feet and head for the canyon entrance. Make them think you're panicking and running scared. Colonel, that's suicide. They'll follow me right into the rocks. Son, trust me. I've been in this exact situation before, and there's only one way out. You're going to thread the needle through Devil's Canyon, and I'm going to guide you through every twist and turn. But first, we need to thin out the opposition. The hostile aircraft were indeed following Jake toward the canyon, convinced they had him trapped. What they didn't know was that Colonel Reeves had flown through Devil's Canyon during test flights 40 years earlier, when he was evaluating the F-16's low-altitude capabilities. He knew every rock formation, every wind current, and every fatal mistake that could kill an unwary pilot. Approaching the canyon entrance now, Ghost Tower. I've got all 4 bogies on my tail, and they're closing fast. Perfect. Now here's the tricky part. At the first bend, there's a knife-edge ridge that'll tear the wing off anything going too fast. You're going to slow down just enough to make that turn, and they're going to overshoot into the rock face. Jake's hands were slick with sweat inside his flight gloves as he approached the canyon at 400 knots, barely 50 feet above the desert floor. Behind him, the hostile aircraft were spread out in pursuit formation, confident in their numerical advantage. Ghost Tower, the first turn is coming up. I can see the ridge you're talking about, and it looks impossible. Son, I've made that turn 100 times. Bank left 45 degrees, reduce throttle to 60%, and trust your aircraft. The F-16 can do things that'll make your hair white, if you let it. Jake threw his fighter into the turn, feeling the G-forces slam him into his seat. The canyon wall flashed past his wingtip, so close he could see individual rocks. Behind him, he heard the screaming whine of jet engines as the lead hostile aircraft tried to match his maneuver. The enemy pilot didn't make it. Jake's radio crackled with a massive explosion as the lead bogey clipped the ridge and disintegrated in a ball of flame and twisted metal. Splash 1, Colonel Reeves announced with grim satisfaction. 3 more to go, and they're going to be a lot more careful now. But the remaining hostile aircraft weren't retreating. Instead, they were splitting up again, with 2 continuing the pursuit through the canyon while the 3rd climbed to block Jake's exit at the far end. Ghost Tower! They're boxing me in! I've got 2 still behind me and 1 waiting at the exit. I see them on radar, son. Here's where it gets interesting. There's a side canyon coming up on your right, barely wide enough for 1 aircraft, but it leads to a hidden valley. The problem is, there's a waterfall at the end with a 90-degree turn that'll kill you if you're not perfectly positioned. Jake was flying by pure instinct now, his training and the colonel's guidance merging into a deadly ballet of survival. The canyon walls were so close, he could see desert wildlife scattering from the thunder of his afterburners. I see the side canyon, but Ghost Tower, my radar altimeter is going crazy. How do you know all this terrain? Colonel Reeves's voice carried a note of nostalgic sadness. Because 43 years ago, I was in your exact position, flying an F-4 Phantom with 3 MiGs on my tail over North Vietnam. I learned that knowing the terrain can mean the difference between going home to your family or becoming a name on a memorial wall. The side canyon was even more treacherous than the main passage. Jake had to slow to 200 knots and fly with surgical precision to avoid the rock walls closing in on both sides. Behind him, only one of the pursuing aircraft was brave enough or foolish enough to follow him into the narrow passage. Ghost Tower, I've got 1 bogey still behind me, and I can hear that waterfall you mentioned. My God, it sounds like a freight train. You're doing great, kid. Now comes the hard part. When you see the waterfall, you'll have about 2 seconds to bank hard right and climb. There's a natural chimney in the rock that leads back to the main valley, but the opening is only about 20 feet wider than your wingspan. Jake could see the waterfall now, a massive cascade of white water plunging into a hidden pool, with rock walls rising vertically on 3 sides. The 4th side showed a narrow gap that looked impossibly small for a fighter jet traveling at 200 miles per hour. I see it, but Ghost Tower, this is insane. There's no way I can fit through that gap. Son, let me tell you something about the F-16. It was designed by pilots who understood that sometimes you need to do the impossible to stay alive. Trust your aircraft, trust your training, and trust an old pilot who's been where you are. Jake approached the waterfall at minimum controllable airspeed, his aircraft shaking from the turbulence created by the massive water flow. Behind him, the pursuing hostile aircraft was closing rapidly, machine guns chattering as bullets sparked off the canyon walls around Jake's fighter. At the last possible second, Jake hauled back on the stick and threw his F-16 into the steepest climb of his life. The aircraft shot through the narrow chimney, with less than 10 feet of clearance on each wingtip, while behind him, the enemy pilot, unable to match the desperate maneuver, slammed into the waterfall in a spectacular explosion. "Splash 2, Colonel Reeves called out. "But don't celebrate yet, son. You've still got 2 hostiles out there, and they're regrouping for another attack." Jake emerged from the canyon system to find himself in a hidden valley he'd never seen on any map. But his relief was short-lived. The remaining 2 hostile aircraft were circling above, waiting for him to climb into their killing zone. "Ghost Tower, I'm trapped in this valley with 2 bogies above me. My fuel is getting low, and I'm almost out of defensive options." Colonel Reeves studied the tactical situation on his radar scope, his mind racing through possibilities. 40 years of combat experience had taught him that sometimes the best defense was an unexpected offense. "Viper 1, I want you to do something that goes against every instinct you have. Climb straight up toward those 2 aircraft and challenge them to a head-on engagement." "Sir, that's suicide. They'll blow me out of the sky." "Not if you do exactly what I tell you. Those pilots have been chasing you for 20 minutes, and they're getting overconfident. They think they have you trapped, but they've forgotten the first rule of air combat: never underestimate a cornered fighter." Jake took a deep breath and pushed his throttle to full military power. His F-16 leaped skyward like a rocket, climbing directly toward the 2 circling enemy aircraft. "Ghost Tower, they're both locking onto me with missiles. I'm dead in 5 seconds. "No, you're not. When I say now, you're going to do a split S maneuver and dive for the deck. But first, I want you to fire everything you've got at the lead aircraft. Don't worry about a perfect shot, just get his attention." Jake's finger hovered over the weapon release button as his HUD showed missile lock on the lead hostile. The range was closing rapidly, and he could see the enemy pilots positioning for what they thought would be an easy kill. "Now!" Colonel Reeves barked. Jake fired his remaining AIM-9 Sidewinder missile and immediately threw his aircraft into an inverted dive that pulled -4 grams, a maneuver that would have made him black out without his G-suit. The hostile aircraft, caught off guard by the sudden aggressive attack, broke formation in confusion. Jake's missile found its mark, destroying the lead enemy fighter in a brilliant fireball. The final hostile pilot, now outnumbered and low on fuel, turned tail and fled toward the border, leaving Jake alone in the desert sky. "Splash 3, and the 4th bogey is bugging out," Colonel Reeves announced, with quiet satisfaction. "Well done, son. You just survived your first real air combat engagement." Jake leveled his aircraft and took stock of his situation. Fuel was critically low. His heart was still racing at twice its normal rate, and his hands were shaking from adrenaline. But he was alive, and the classified airspace was secure. "Ghost Tower, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life out there." "Son, that's what we old pilots do. We pass on what we've learned to the next generation, hoping they'll never need it, but knowing they will. Now let's get you back on the ground before you run out of gas." The flight back to Nellis was uneventful, but emotional. Jake found himself thinking about the calm voice that had guided him through the most terrifying experience of his life. He'd never heard of Colonel Sam Reeves, but he was determined to find the man and thank him properly. After landing and debriefing with intelligence officers about the hostile aircraft encounter, Jake made his way to the control tower. He asked everyone he met about the colonel who had helped him, but received only puzzled looks. "Colonel Reeves?" the duty controller said, scratching his head. "I don't know any Colonel Reeves. Are you sure that's who you talked to?" Jake was insistent. He'd heard the voice clearly, had followed the man's instructions, and owed his life to the mysterious pilot. Finally, an older sergeant overhearing the conversation approached with a strange expression. "Son," the sergeant said quietly, Colonel Sam Reeves was a legend around here, but he's been dead for 15 years, killed in a car accident on his way to his retirement ceremony. They named the new pilot training building after him. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. I talked to him for 20 minutes. He guided me through that entire engagement. The sergeant led Jake to a display case in the lobby of the pilot training building. Inside was a photograph of a distinguished older man in a flight suit, with gray eyes that Jake recognized immediately. The nameplate read, Colonel Samuel Iron Eagle Reeves, 1948 to 2008, 200 combat missions, 47 years of service, mentor to 3 generations of fighter pilots. The old-timers say he still watches over young pilots, the sergeant said softly. They call it Ghost Tower, when a pilot in trouble hears a voice that saves their life, but no one else was on the radio frequency. Happened a dozen times over the years, always when a rookie was about to get himself killed. Jake stared at the photograph for a long time, remembering the calm, confident voice that had guided him through his darkest hour. Whether it had been supernatural intervention, radio interference, or simply his own subconscious drawing on half-remembered training scenarios, he would never know for certain. But that evening, as he wrote his after-action report, Jake found himself addressing it not just to his commanding officer, but to the ghost of Colonel Sam Reeves. He wrote about courage under fire, the importance of mentorship, and the bonds that connect all pilots who have faced death in the sky. 3 months later, Jake was selected for the Top Gun program, and eventually became one of the finest fighter pilots of his generation. He never forgot the voice from Ghost Tower, and as he grew older and more experienced, he found himself taking extra time to mentor younger pilots, sharing his knowledge, and keeping watch over those who might need a guiding voice in their moment of greatest peril. Years later, when Jake had become a colonel himself and was nearing retirement, he received a letter from a young lieutenant who had survived a harrowing engagement over hostile territory. The pilot thanked him for the calm voice on the radio that had guided him to safety, but Jake had been in a briefing at the time and had never made the radio call. Standing in the same control tower where his own life had been saved, Colonel Jake Morrison smiled and looked up at the photograph of Colonel Sam Reeves. "Thank you for teaching me how to pass it on," he whispered. The tradition continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere above the desert, the Ghost Tower frequency remained open, ready to guide the next young pilot through their moment of truth, when the difference between life and death could be measured in the wisdom of a voice from the past. In the squadron-ready room, new pilots still heard the stories of Ghost Tower, and though some laughed and others remained skeptical, they all secretly hoped that if they ever found themselves alone and outnumbered in hostile skies, a calm, experienced voice would come over the radio to guide them home. The sky belonged to all pilots, living and dead, and the bonds forged in combat transcended the boundaries between heaven and earth. What an incredible story of mentorship, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between pilots. Whether you believe in ghostly guidance or simply the power of training and instinct, Jake's survival reminds us that heroes come in many forms. If this thrilling tale of aerial combat and supernatural mentorship captivated you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories of courage in the face of impossible odds. What do you think really happened in Ghost Tower? Share your thoughts in the comments below.